Who gon' take it there? 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 Electricity, 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 electricity. You know what's in the air. 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 It's possibility. It's possibility. It's possibility. It's possibility.
All right, so Jon Stewart did this interview with The New Yorker. It was like a live interview on stage, one of these ritzy type deals, kind of meant to be a profile of him, but really they just talked about politics at large the entire time, which isn't out of character for Jon Stewart. Obviously, he's a person who's interested in that kind of thing, and he's one of these people that's facing threat from Paramount of, is he going to get shut down because of Trump or whatever. So that's a little bit what they talked about here. I was more interested in some of the other stuff that he got into. He mentioned people throwing his name around as a possible presidential candidate in 2028, as well as who he thinks would be a good candidate. He talks a little bit about Joe Rogan and defends him against accusations that he's some kind of like right-wing monster, as well as also addressing the Riyadh Comedy Festival and Gaza and Palestine. All these things relatively briefly. This interview is also heavily edited. There's a lot of chops and cuts in it. So definitely a lot got cut out. I don't know. Maybe it's mostly inconsequential. I guess we'll never know. But here's the first clip where he talks about Joe Rogan. He's asked about going on Joe Rogan, and he gives his opinion on that.
You've been on Rogan a couple of times?
Yes.
What did you think of that experience, being on Joe Rogan?
I enjoyed being on Rogan. I think he's an interesting interviewer. There are right-wing, weaponized commentators whose sole purpose is to manipulate things to the benefit of the Bannon Project or the Project 2025. Rogan's not that guy.
What is that guy? How would you describe
that guy
him?
is a curious comic who fell into this thing that got fucking enormous, maybe doesn't... has opinions all over the political spectrum, but has tendencies that people on the left does not fit the aesthetic. He's a hunter.
In fairness, he's had people on who are kind of Nazi curious. That's not good.
I've interviewed Kissinger. And he was carpet bomb curious. I don't know what to say.
And what happens with Rogan sometimes is he'll hear somebody that's on the dangerous end of the spectrum, and he'll just kind of soak it in.
And this is, I think this is a great point. And it's whoever job who thinks that information is dangerous, to fight to get their point of view out there to counter what they think is misinformation. You can't just deputize people to say he should have known better and he should have prosecuted that point. And my biggest frustration, honestly, with a lot of scientists is they all go, RFK, oh, he's so fucked up, that's terrible information. Oh, okay, what's the information? Nothing. Where are they? Get out there, fight.
Yeah, so he's given Joe Rogan way too much credit here. In some ways, he has a point, and it's a similar point that I've made when it comes to the sort of aesthetics of the type of person that Joe Rogan is. But the interviewer does a good job of cutting in to say, this is a guy who's platformed some pretty horrible people who are laundering actually genuinely harmful rhetoric sort of through Joe Rogan. And it's interesting to characterize him as just sort of sitting there and soaking it in, because in doing that, he kind of becomes the audience in the sense. And so his show is basically there for the audience to do the same thing, just sort of soak in what the person is saying. I think that taking the stance that Joe Rogan is, mostly a normal guy and not a sort of weaponized tool of the right, I think that's kind of the opinion of somebody who hasn't watched much Joe Rogan lately, because when you tap in with his show, there's a lot of parts of it that aren't talking about politics, but almost any time it veers into politics, it goes pretty far right-wing. Joe Rogan takes in a lot of far right-wing, like conspiracy type stuff. Sometimes it gets fact-checked on the show. Oftentimes it doesn't, and it just flies. And stuff like that comes out of his mouth all the time. He just kind of shovels it at the audience. He's probably the main spreader of misinformation, disinformation, whatever you want to call it. Certainly medical misinformation. He's the leading voice, there's no question. And Stewart makes this point that, if there's people out there who think that that's misinformation and harmful information, then you got to get out there and do the work and counter it. And that's true, but it's kind of this free market approach to a larger societal problem. And the question is, in what way can the government, but also society at large, create an environment that isn't so ripe for brain-rotted misinformation. And another thing that Stewart talks about in this interview is, the social media algorithms and how it sort of warps your brain. I didn't include any of that because honestly, it's kind of cliche at this point. Maybe it needs said, but I feel like it's been said a lot. I've certainly said it a lot. And so while I think it's true to say, all of us are being radicalized by algorithms that kind of bypass the discernment and critical thinking of our brains. And so I think that that's true and an accurate assessment. But then when you get to the point of a guy like Joe Rogan, who's making millions and millions and millions of dollars, because the misinformation gets more clicks, that's the operative dynamic that he's missing a little bit here, is that it's not just a matter of outcompete. How many scientists are there out there on YouTube that spend their whole life debunking Joe Rogan? Some of them have huge audiences. Most of them have nowhere near the type of audience as Joe Rogan. And we're increasingly entering a society that the monetization structures of these businesses are geared towards right-wing disinformation. That was already true in 2016, and that wasn't even necessarily how they were designed. It just kind of happened that way because misinformation travels faster than the debunking. And so now we're only hurtling towards a direction where that's the only type of content that the market itself favors, let alone the fact that they seem to want to institute market controls that only boost right-wing misinformation. So in other words, you're going to need a better solution than just outcompete them in the marketplace. That's not going to work. And it's honestly indicative of a sort of neoliberal mindset that I don't think is going to cut it in the next generation of progressive leadership. But before we get to that, let's listen to what Jon Stewart had to say about the Riyadh Comedy Festival and the pushback that comedians got about it.
Jon, what did you think of the recent, the business of comedians going to Riyadh and being paid a lot of money? What did you think of that?
I don't touch other people's money. And, it's hard, man. I want to fix my house. I want to operate with integrity, but I don't want to gatekeep. I don't go to the tree of hilarity and get visited by the fathers of, and I think a lot of comics who came out and really shit on those guys, I know a couple of them and I know them actually to be like garbage humans. So I would have preferred if they would have just come out though and said it's money and not it's a way to start a conversation. Would you have started the conversation for $2,500? Well, then that's the difference. Look, I worked for Apple. There's a lot of people who believe that Apple is exploitative in a way that's horrific. We all have our lines that we are willing to cross. We get into a problem when we're unforgiving.
Because, as we started the conversation, you're facing a complicated situation at Paramount.
Sure.
And you know what you won't do, but if you see something else happening in the company, do you know where those lines are? Like with the news.
Yeah. They've already done things that I'm upset about. But then if I had integrity, maybe I would stand up and go, I'm out. Or maybe the integrity thing to do would be to stay in it and keep fighting. In the foxhole, I love a good argument. I love differing points of view in all facets of things, but I also love grace. I've got people in my family that are to the right of Attila the Hun, and when people tell me how can you platform that person on your show, I go, I platform my uncle every fucking Thanksgiving.
All right, so kind of a couple different branches to this conversation here. He's pretty much defending the Riyadh Comedy Festival guys. He's saying he wishes they were more honest about the fact that they just did it for money and didn't try to make some kind of philosophical argument about it, which I agree with. He also says that he thinks some of the people doing this criticism of the guys who went to the festival are garbage humans, in his words. He's definitely talking specifically about Marc Maron there. Maybe he has somebody else in mind too, maybe David Cross, but Marc Maron is specifically the one that is widely hated, and especially with Jon Stewart. They have a history together. Marc Maron was really, really terrible to Jon Stewart purely out of jealousy, and he's admitted that, talked about it on the record, and it's pretty much open in the air that Jon Stewart also has no interest in talking to him about it. So that's pretty much where that stands. And he's saying that doing that type of criticism is cheap, and it's easy to try to tear somebody down for something that they did. I think this is where I see a little bit of lack of conviction from him. And it's not to say that you have to show conviction on every single issue. Who really cares what Jon Stewart thinks about the Riyadh Comedy Festival? Doesn't really matter, except for the fact that, you know, he goes to this thing of saying some people feel, I work for the company Apple, some people feel that that company is exploitative in a horrific way. And he doesn't work for the company Apple still, as I understand it. But I don't know, isn't there a lack of clarity in that statement? Some people feel that Apple is an enormously exploitative company. Wouldn't it just be more honest to say Apple is an exploitative company? And so I think that that indicates what Jon Stewart is good at, which is having a sense of what animates people and what people are upset by, and giving a very rational voice to that concern. And so that's why I think Jon Stewart has built up a ton of respect amongst wide audiences in his ability to, you know, critique the current state of society. But the long-standing critique that many people have had of Jon Stewart is, you know, his rally to restore sanity and this sort of his instinct, his impulse to not just critique both sides, but to try to frame it as though both sides are equally crazy. He certainly was doing that in the pre-Trump era, and I don't think he does that anymore. I think he has absorbed that criticism. But I also think that that impulse is still there, and you see it on display here, where he's not really taking firm positions on this stuff. And so to me, it seems that Jon Stewart is better at voicing criticisms than he is at deciding what he actually thinks. And that's okay. There's a place in society for that. But when it comes to him being considered as a frontrunner for the Democratic Party, I don't know if I agree with that, because at least in this interview, I'm not hearing concrete positions that he agrees with. I'm hearing more critiques on political strategy. It seems to be more what he's interested in. And look, I do the same thing, but I try to be clear about what positions I support at the same time. So, I mean, if we're looking for real leadership, I think you need somebody who genuinely has some ideas in mind that they support. So let me play this clip where he addresses that real quick, and then I'll get into that some more.
You mentioned idealists in the Democratic Party and figures who are just not up to the task. Mm-hmm. You mentioned Mamdani for one. Who do you see on a national level who has promise as a national leader that you could get behind? You have 20 minutes. Somebody just said you.
Oh. Have we really gotten to that point? I do understand. You know what is interesting? That's also a function of frustration.
A cry of desperation.
You know what it is? Because I'm other. I'm none of the above. I have never, in the audiences that come into the show, seen them so thirsty for leadership. And so the none of the above, the Democratic Party is ripe for what happened to the Republican Party in 2016. But hopefully it will be somebody who uses that power for good and not for self-aggrandizement and not for their own, gratification.
All right, so here again, he's saying things that are true. These are true observations. But to me, it feels a little bit easy. It feels like he's not saying anything that bold. And so he's good at articulating a pretty sharp critique, but it stops short of articulating a vision. And so that's why I appreciate the fact that he's not really positioning himself as a front runner in 2028 or somebody who wants to run for president. I don't think he does. And I don't think he's the right person for it. And I think people want that from him because he's an entertainer and he kind of answers to the Trump concept that if you're good on TV, then you can do politics and you can communicate policy ideas really well. And, people want somebody who's no bullshit, somebody who can reach across the aisle a little bit, but is a fighter. I think Jon Stewart showing up on the issue of relief for the 9/11 first responders and his lobbying for that and how passionately he defended them is a thing that has really indicated integrity on his part. And I think a lot of people on the opposite side of Jon Stewart have a lot of respect for him. However, I think when it comes to being a politician and creating a platform and running on it, that's where I feel like Jon Stewart would not be a concrete enough candidate. Because while he gestures towards the more progressive solutions and he says a lot of things that people more progressive than the Democratic Party would say in critique of the Democratic Party, again, he's stopping short of saying a single candidate that he supports. And he had an interview with Zoran, and it went well. He seems like he likes Zoran, and it was a good critical interview where he asked him about, like, what's your public safety policy and stuff like that. And in a lot of cases, you see people, again, making the same critiques, understanding the same issues with the Democratic Party, but not really embracing policy solutions that break up the muck of the Democratic Party. And so I fear that going in that direction rhetorically, without focusing on a really clear articulation of policy positions that differentiate from the normal milieu of the Democratic Party, we're going to end up in this place where we have establishment candidates who are making these anti-establishment critiques without offering any policy. Do I think that's going to get very far? Probably not. But I think if the establishment feels that they can get any momentum whatsoever doing that, they're going to try to shoehorn that in. And that's where I feel like, I don't know that Jon Stewart would fall victim to that exactly, but I'm not hearing enough of a firm commitment on healthcare, for example. And when talking to Kamala Harris recently, he said, is healthcare a human right? I don't know. He just doesn't seem firmly committed to these things. So he's a good commentator, he's good at critique, and maybe he'll be good at pushing the Democratic Party in the right direction. But it seems to me that when you ask him about his beliefs and what he thinks, he gets a little mealy-mouthed. So let me play this last clip where he talks briefly about Gaza and Israel, and then I'll wrap this up by talking about the race that's happening in Minneapolis on Tuesday.
What's it been like for you to think and talk about what's been happening in Gaza for the last 2 years? How have you been affected?
Super fun at Passover.
Yeah.
It's a really fraught and complicated emotional issue, obviously, for a lot of Jews. But again, I try to speak as best I can, in my opinion, as honestly as I can. And if that means upsetting certain people, I'm always open to the conversation. But I have very strong opinions about the horror of what I see over there on all sides. I'm on team human. I don't think that, look, I grew up, man, as David. We were all David, not Remnick, obviously, but biblical. And I think feeling like David became Goliath was a hard thing to counsel for myself.
Yeah, so on a human level, I don't think that that's that bad of an answer on Gaza and Israel. But it has a little bit of that mealy-mouthed quality, right? Like saying, I have strong beliefs on this, but he doesn't articulate a single one. He says, I have strong beliefs about the horror of what I'm seeing there from both sides. So right there, that kind of like waters down the whole strong beliefs thing. I'm not saying you can't have critiques of both sides. I do. But when you are being put on the spot to give your opinion about that issue, and you kind of immediately deflect to the sort of both sides thing, again, it would have been better if he articulated an actual, it's okay to say it from both sides, but hey, look, one of these sides is way more powerful and way more destructive and murderous and deadly. That's a pretty good thing to say. And he seems to gesture at that. He seems to gesture that that's what he thinks without actually saying it. And so again, my goal here is not to dunk on Jon Stewart or act like he's the worst person. I don't think this is the worst thing for him to say in this moment. I think the David and Goliath metaphor is very apt, but I don't think that this is the material of somebody who's going to lead the progressive wing of the party. It's just an indication. It's an indication of if somebody is in the right place in terms of their moral compass. And I think Jon Stewart has a good moral compass in terms of directing the conversation and calling out people's bullshit and trying to appeal to rationality. But I don't know if he has the same moral compass on issues. I don't feel like I've seen that from him. And so, I like him. I hope he keeps doing what he's doing at The Daily Show. I don't like him as a presidential candidate, and I'll leave it at that. So the last thing I want to mention here is the race on Tuesday for mayor in Minneapolis. This is the race that Omar Fateh, who is being called the Mamdani of Minneapolis, He's running for mayor. He was endorsed by the local Democratic Party, and that endorsement was then revoked, and that caused a bunch of hubbub. And this is a candidate who's pretty similar to Mamdani on a lot of his policy issues, wants to raise the minimum wage, wants to do things differently on policing, although he has moderated his positions a little bit on policing. And that is something that we've seen now in multiple instances when it comes to these progressive candidates on a local level, especially for mayor, is that they will have a history of speaking very harshly about the police department, and Zoran with NYPD saying, that they're racist. Lots of things that lots of people were saying during a certain time period, that when they're running for these mayorships or other seats, suddenly that type of statement makes them less viable. And we'll see. We do not know if it's possible for a candidate to win a seat like that or a job like that without moderating on the so-called defund the police issue. And in both cases, they're able to get across, articulate, different visions for how to run the police department, which I think is important. But still, even these progressives are running away from this defund the police idea. Minneapolis is the city where George Floyd was murdered. And this is one of the only races in the country where the George Floyd incident and how it was handled is still on front and center in the political conversation. So I think, given that Mamdani wins, and hopefully given that Fateh wins on Tuesday, if you're in Minneapolis, please go vote for him. Please volunteer and phone bank for him if you can. If he wins, I think that the policing issue is very likely to come back to the front and center of American politics. How that intertwines with the ICE issue and sanctuary cities, I'm not sure. We have yet to see. But the race is a lot closer for Fateh. So we'll see what happens on Tuesday. This guy winning in Minneapolis would be another huge victory for the Democratic Party. And like I said, he's pretty similar to Mamdani, but has a little bit less momentum. So get out there and vote for him if you can. Spread the word if you can. And I'll update once we know what happens.
Pressure getting pressed, do you feel it now? What even happens next, I don't really know. Voice carries less, can you hear me now? Soon as I get blessed, time's running out. Pressure getting pressed. Pressure getting pressed. Feel the pressure getting pressed. Yeah. Pressure, do you feel it now? I'm just saying.